Hello everyone. Thank you for coming to the stream of our GDC talk. Hopefully you can all hear us. I'm just going to check the Twitch quickly. Yeah, that all looks good. Yay, hello. Yeah, so thanks for joining us, and sorry that this was postponed from last week. Unfortunately, I got sick, but now I'm feeling much better, so we're all ready to go. And are you ready, Younès?
Yeah, everything's good on my end, so let's go whenever you want.
Okay. In which case, without further ado, we will start our presentation. Choose your own misadventure, the future of AI for game design. Right, so hello. If you didn't know, we're Florence and Younès. We're both members of the Knives and Paintbrushes AI Research Collective, and we're both currently studying for PhDs in games AI. And we want to use AI to change how people design games and the kinds of games it's possible to design. But what is games AI research? Well, before the term artificial intelligence was even coined, Alan Turing was created a chess computer program in the late 1940s. So really right from the beginning, games have been a part of artificial intelligence research. And games are often used as a testbed for AI agents because they represent kind of a controlled space to do that. And you probably heard of these kind of high profile cases of AIs beating like chess champions and things like that. So there's often like a lot of emphasis on the intelligence part of artificial intelligence. But since the early 2000s, the games AI research field has grown into its own subfield, and it's kind of covering all kinds of different things, more kind of creative pursuits, such as automated game design.
And recently, in the last 10 years, we experienced a thing we later coined the AI boom. This is a massive round of investment in AI, massive advances in techniques. And often when we speak of that boom, we have in mind big private labs like OpenAI and DeepMind. The AI boom is a nice choice of word because in many ways, this is an explosion in the sense that it both moves pretty fast and also it has broken a lot of things in different sectors, in games, but also in healthcare and policymaking and other domains. And now that private AI labs are backing away from game research, we are left with remnants, their leftovers, and it's up to pick us the pieces and make sense of what is left. The goal of this talk is to explore what kind of future AI can bring to game design, especially from the lenses of game creators. In this talk, we'd like to do three things. Those are the three parts of this talk. In the first part, we will we'll study two examples of how AI can be used to harm people, how it can be used badly in games. Then after that, we will see of examples where AI can be used responsibly and in innovative and interesting ways to make games better, but often in ways that are overlooked now, or ways that we don't think about when we speak about AI. And finally, we will take lessons from these two parts and share with you a vision of a kind of future we can create within game designs in the future. And hopefully we'd like to build this future with you. In the words of critically acclaimed 2020 video game Disco Elysium, après la mort, la vie. Wait, is that right? No, it's après la vie, la mort, après la mort, la vie de nouveau. All right, let's go. So first part, let's look into the ethical failures of AI within games. Our first case today is a game platform named AI Dungeon. So what is AI Dungeon? As a concept, it's pretty simple. It's a platform where you log on and play text adventure games. Those are games where the interface presents you with the beginning of a story, and you enter what kind of actions you want your character to do, what kind of things you want your character to say. Classically, you either use a prompter, so you write in a custom language for the game, or you choose among pre-selected options that are pre-written by the game designers. What is interesting with an AI Dungeon is that you don't choose pre-selected or pre-written answers in the game. You just write in plain language, in plain English, whatever you want the character to do. And the game will do its best to write a coherent and next text for the story. Let's give some stats. In February last year, AI Dungeon had 1.5 million monthly active users and gathered $3.3 million in seed funding. So this is a kind of success, right? Let's look a bit more behind the curtain and see how it works. The model that runs behind AI Dungeon is based on a model that existed and was designed, a neural network trained by this company named OpenAI. They switched version recently. They went from a model named GPT-2 to GPT-3. And in this sense, this model is very simple. It works a bit like the autocompleter from your phone, in the sense that you write the beginning of a sentence and the model does its best to predict what could be the next word or the next sentence. It does that by looking at all the words in the dictionary and rank them from less likely to more likely and choose ones among the more likely. The thing is about this technique is that it needs a lot of example texts to be coherent and even more to be interesting. Which brings us to this question. Where do the stories in AI Dungeon come from? Who wrote them? This is a complex question, of course, and we'll do our best to give you at least a partial answer. Among the training data of AI Dungeon, there is a part that comes from the model it was based on, the GPT-2 or GPT-3 itself. And we have a bit of knowledge about how it was trained. We know that it was trained on a corpus of text named the Common Crawl, which is an enormous amount of text gathered from the internet by a specific group of people. This corpus of text had 156 billion words or things similar to words. And these texts come from 365 million websites. The thing is, we don't really know which ones because they purposefully left out that information from the data. But recent work have tried to retro-engineer how this corpus was created to study what kind of things it contains. And what is first remarkable is the things that are not in the datasets. Specifically, this study showed that text written by Black authors or Hispanic authors were filtered out of a datasets. This can be done in pretty easy ways, often not intended, but still existing nonetheless. Like, for instance, filtering all texts featuring the instance of the N-word, even though it could be used from the perspective of a person belonging to the Afro-American group who has reclaimed this word and who use it internally in a way that is not oppressive. This is about the same from text coming from LGBTQI plus groups. So all text discussing their sexualities or their gender affirmation or their way of life, their way of thinking, and their way of criticizing current society will be very likely to be left off the datasets. And for things that are in there, for things that are actually in the datasets, there are some very stark disproportions in there. For instance, there's a huge part of the datasets who comes from US and UK military websites or Google patterns, for instance. We also know that models trained with these specific datasets have a very strong negative feeling against our people. This is just a part of it. This is already pretty bad, but there's also another part. AI Dungeon is at the end a way to play text adventure games. So the designers needed to train the model specifically to produce this kind of game. So what they did is that they found a website run by a community of textual adventures game makers named chooseastory.com and simply downloaded all of their games and used it as a training data. Without asking them, without any consent, some of them found out and some of them were pretty angry that it happened. What is interesting about the games that are on this website is that some of them, a good part of them, are of pornographic nature. And some of them within that part include sensitive content like role-playing, sexually harassing women, for instance. Obviously, this type of content needs to be carefully handled with ways to make sure that consent and boundaries are clearly set and respected. And which brings us to our next question. Do you think that AI Dungeon, in the way it was made, is able to respect these necessary boundaries? Well, the answer seems to be no. We have documented evidence that people played the AI Dungeon, and a good amount of them, and had regular adventures, and suddenly slipped into the realm of erotic games in real sexual situations without them prompting the game to do so. Some of these stories involve sexually abusive content. Some of these stories even involved explicitly minor characters. And this is a strong failure. If your game leads to creating these kind of situations, this can be seen as a massive failure. What we want to ask with you during this talk is questions like, was it even possible to avoid given the structure they used? After all, they had no control over where the texts come from. They don't know who wrote them, what they contain. It's scrapped from the internet, but they don't have any more information, no ways to select it, no way to ask people even if they are okay with them using this content for the game. So there's no way to identify people and creators. There's no way to ask for their consent. Both can be summed up into the two sentences. You wouldn't let random users write text directly into a game without any ways to moderate this. And on the flip side, you wouldn't download stories and use them into a commercial game that gathers millions without asking at least permission. Well, this is the kind of stuff that happened within AI Dungeon, and which AI tools and techniques made easier to do. This is only an example of a specific mindset that is present in games and AI communities, a mindset that aims to produce cheap new content quickly at the expense of both the creators and the player communities. And this kind of harm especially targets people that are already oppressed. That's it for our first case study.
Right, so on to the next study, which is everyone's favorite type of games, crypto games. So why are we talking about crypto games? The main reason is that there is an important link between AI and crypto games. It's not as obvious as the link in the last case study that Younès just presented, AI Dungeon. It's much more covert, but it's just as insidious. So that's why we really wanted to talk about it. And on this slide, I've kind of presented the general arguments I'm going to be making in this section, which are broadly that crypto games encourage players to gamble. The link between gambling games, there is a link between gambling games and disordered gaming, and AI can be used to predict player behavior in gambling games. So first of all, the link between crypto games and gambling. So in a study by Sarada et al., in which they looked at the crypto game CryptoKitties, they concluded that blockchains are mainly used for two types of games, online casinos and collectibles. So the vast majority of crypto games can be classed as gambling games, and CryptoKitties is a really good example of this. So CryptoKitties is a game that came out in 2017. It includes these CryptoKitties, which you can buy, sell, trade, or breed in order to create other kitties. And these kitties are essentially NFTs. And Sarada et al. Actually compared the kitties to YouTube unboxing videos, because there's kind of this sense of you don't know when you breed two together exactly what's going to happen. The child kitty might have traits from the two parents, but they also may have kind of these rare and more valuable traits. So there's this sense of, oh, what's in the box? What kind of kitty am I going to get? This is this kind of like element of gambling that you see in it, because there are kind of unknown future events which are random. And that's why these kind of games can be classed as gambling. You might kind of say or argue, well, okay, but most free-to-play games are like this, right? And that is true. But there's this really great point in an article by Schultz et al. In which they say that unlike most free-to-play games, in crypto games, the in-game currency is often exchangeable and can be used to pay for other goods and services outside of gameplay and can be cashed out. So there's this extra level to it. So now kind of looking at the link between crypto games and player well-being. So ideas around gaming addiction are very controversial in the gaming sphere. So we wanted to look at a term which is disordered gaming, which was put forward by David Zandel. And this term relates to that which causes significant impairment or distress. And the important thing about this term is that it's something which is self-identified by an individual. So they themselves identify that they are experiencing distress because of this disordered gaming behavior. And there have been studies that kind of show that playing these crypto games has, bad effects on people's well-being. There was a qualitative study of Axie Infinity, which is a play-to-earn game, and I think was also very recently in the news because they were hacked and something like that. So that's a whole other story, but it's bad for many reasons. But their study showed that a lot of these players who are play-to-earn were students struggling during the pandemic, and they had to play the game very late at night because that's the only time they had for it. So this game is preying on people who are already in a financially precarious situation. But what is the link with AI, right? Well, we already have machine learning models that predict player churn. Player churn is the point at which a player stops putting money into a game. And the reason why we have these models is in order to optimize player spending. It's to get people to spend more, right? And we have websites like Dat Radar, which kind of track things like at what point new players are coming in to these crypto games like My Crypto Heroes, as you can see in the graph on the slide there. What is the future of crypto games? What does this mean more generally? In a sense, it may seem like maybe this is a non-issue because you see a lot of stuff in the media about how unstable these currencies are. There has been a backlash against them. And also there was a 2022 survey by GDC called the Game State of the Industry Survey. And they found when they asked if people were interested in NFTs, the vast majority of them were not interested. But there was still 21% who were somewhat interested. And I'm very interested in that kind of almost a quarter of people who I feel that are potentially interested in investing in this. You may see this as an opportunity. And I want to kind of round off this section by, funnily enough, referencing a 20th century academic called Walter Benjamin. Now, Walter Benjamin had this concept of the aura. And the aura for artwork is sort of its specific historical and cultural context, which makes an original piece of artwork very special. And you can see how this links with NFTs, right? Because with NFTs, there's this whole discourse of, you can prove you have this digital original. And some NFT enthusiasts have argued that, in fact, NFTs bring back the aura, right? But the thing is that, ironically, Benjamin wasn't necessarily arguing that the aura was a good thing. In fact, he was arguing that the mechanical reproduction of art could be a good thing because it makes it accessible for more people. So I suppose what I really want to round off here about crypto games is to say that we shouldn't be chasing digital scarcity. That is yet another reason not to go after crypto games. And as a general kind of takeaway point, crypto games are based around gambling mechanics, and player data can be leveraged through AI techniques for exploitative purposes. So in this section, we've seen two case studies, AI Dungeon and crypto games. And in both cases, AI was enforced on creators and players to try and extract values behind the scenes in ways that often are kind of not very obvious and difficult to kind of understand from the outside. And that kind of is a further level of insidiousness to it. But now we get to look at the positive overlooked successes. And the first case study in this section is about Wildermyth. So Wildermyth is a role-playing fantasy game which came out recently, and it employs procedural narratives, so narratives that include algorithmically generated content. But of course, It's not the first game to have done this. Actually, since the 1980s, we've had games with procedurally generated stories. And on the screen here, you can see several screenshots of different games with procedural narratives in them. And interestingly, they all have different kind of aesthetics and different mechanics. And here I've got a quote from Lewis Gordon, his piece, which was kind of looking at procedural narrative games. And I really liked his point that Wildermyth is part of this long procedural storytelling tradition. And what's really exciting is that actually there's still so much room to experiment and grow in this area. How does the procedural storytelling work in Wildermyth? So the game uses this model called the Library of Plays. And basically what that means is that writers for the game have written some sort of generic kind of games, generic kind of stories that can be slotted into your gameplay, depending on what kind of events have happened and what the personality traits of the heroes in your party are. And to give you an example from my own playthrough, I had a character called Maya who died. And this triggered a particular story called The Golden Mountain. And Maya was very close to another character in my party called Hart. And then he was kind of lamenting her death. And then eventually I had the option to build a cairn to her on the map. And this shows how kind of a story that would have been just written sort of almost as like, I guess, a kind of skeleton of a story for any kind of characters to be slotted in, when it was actually in my playthrough, it felt very personal. So I thought that was a really good example of this. And another really cool aspect of this is that in the game, they're able to attribute specific authors to particular stories, like this example here with the Golden Mountain. I was lucky enough to talk with Nate Austin, who's one of the developers on the team who made the game. And when I sort of asked him why they went for this procedural storytelling technique, he said that a big goal from the outset for the team was to kind of have this large expressive space for players, this freedom to feel like they had this unique band of heroes. They could also like replay the game and feel like they were getting unique stories each time. And in terms of his recommendations for any other devs who are interested in doing things like this, he said that it's important to know what you're generating from the outset. So try and create by hand what you're aiming to generate, so you have something to kind of aim for. And don't be afraid to mix different methods. You don't have to be a purist about it. They found that combining PCG and handcrafted content was really effective for them. So that's something to look into as well. But you always have to be prepared to prune the PCG, because ultimately it's not a totally automated process. There will always be tinkering and tweaking here and there. And also Nate Austin did a talk at GDC. So if you have the opportunity, please do check it out, because I'm sure he goes into lots of great detail about the game in there. And to finish this section, I want to kind of round off by looking at PCG as labor. Alina Chia recently published an article which, funnily enough, was a survey of instances in which procedurally generated content had been discussed in the last 10 years at GDC. And she found that PCG is often framed as a solution to a labor problem, but that's problematic, because then it justifies mass layoffs, but it also devalues the work of different digital artists, writers, and more. And also it kind of passes over the particular skills and labor that goes into doing PCG, right? There's always this tinkering. It never happens in a vacuum. So kind of the point I really want to end on in this section is that PCG is not a replacement for writing. It is a tool for different kinds of storytelling in games.
Excellent. Now on to our final case study, and the second one on the good examples of AI usage in games. And this time we will have a look into modding communities. But before that, we'll give you two definitions that are going to be useful in this discussion. They come from the domain of PCG. Those are terms we use frequently to think about PCG and its relationship to the content we create within games and the games experienced by the players. And these ideas are named possibility space and generative space. To put it simply, possibility space is the ensemble, all the realm of possible things that a person could experience while playing a game. But the thing is that generative space is a subset of that possibility space, and generative space is only the thing that the game is programmed to do, is programmed to go and explore when you use it or download it as a blank state vanilla with nothing when added, just by following the rules, basically. For instance, if we take a popular game that came out recently, I'm speaking about Chess 2022. In the case of chess, the studio that released it only gave us one map with a king, a queen, a bishop, a knight, a rook, and pawns. So this map is on the generative space. But there's nothing that could prevent you to play with only horses, for instance. Like the game can run this specific map, only you and a bunch of horses. But the thing is, even if that thing is in the realm of possibilities, everything in game can run it. It is not into the realm of what is generated by the game, which is what the game serves you, what it gives you. And often, game developers are interested into ways to expand generative space and to conquer more possibility space, to augment the possibilities and the realm of experiences that players could do. It's more complicated than that. It's not just a matter of expanding always, but that's the original idea behind BCG. Techniques to do that, the number one for game devs is to simply work more, to just create more contents that are going to fill the game manually. The second technique is to use procedural generation algorithms or the processes. And the thing is, what Florence just told us is that it's also another way of working. But if you're a player, but not a game developer, there's a way you can augment the generative space of a game that you just bought and that you just got a copy of. That thing is downloading and installing a mod. Game modifications, or mods for short, are pieces of software often that you add onto an original version of a game, which we often call vanilla version. There are games that exist and are active thanks to their very rich and active modding community. Games like Stardew Valley, Minecraft, and Skyrim, and even super old game like Doom. I'm sorry for people in the audience. We were born after Doom was released, so it's officially an old game. Sorry. So even games like Doom still are played today and are enjoyed by their community because they are involved in making the game evolve from the original copy that ID Software released in '93. And often mod contents can be simple things, like simple UI tweaks, or even complex ones. It can be types of balancing, changing the equilibrium of some things that the developers wanted to do this way, but players prefer to experience it another way. But they can even go to have entirely new storylines, new monsters, new dungeons, new items, and graphical changes, for instance. We have here an example of the Doom 2 neural upscale 2x mod, 2x, I think, where you have a neural network model who looked at the texture from the original Doom and tried to expand it in a eye-pleasing way to fit modern hardwares. And what's interesting is that when we look a bit more into it, this is not an isolated case. AI techniques and AI development has a very strong link with modding and the communities that exist around it. And I'm not speaking only about the communities that want to add things to the current experience of the game. This can be also linked to communities that experience the games in ways that are fundamentally different from what the developers wanted to do in the first place. I'm speaking of communities like people who play randomizers, people who play with specific constraints or accessibility tools. For instance, playing Dark Souls only using voice commands. The whole speedrunning community that is now very widespread and known, and even people who train for competitive play like chess tournaments or training esports teams. you belong to a kind of modding community that you call, not really a community, but use tools which are akin to modding, like tools that assist players with decision making or that give analysis and information to train yourself. And when you look a bit more into it, these communities revolve around existing complex tech tools, what we could call AI. These are procedural generation algorithms. These are, for instance, speech-to-text in the case of accessibility or constraints using. For speedrunning communities, you have tool-assisted superplay. And of course, for chess tournaments or esports, you have AI evaluation, which is a big part of having information about the game and using that information to enhance your skills. So game modifications are very linked with AI, and they can enrich the possibilities of a game generative space. And there are some games who learn how to leverage that. Here are 2 examples. For instance, we have Animal Crossing, who gave players the tools inside the game, not outside of it, to easily create content and share it and build a whole mechanic around it. That is a sort of modding that is now part of the game itself, letting players draw textures themselves and share them without having to go on forums. Everything's accessible in game. This of course leads to players to express themselves in interesting ways and even expand the range of things that can be represented in Animal Crossing, even though the developing team had a limited amount of time resources. They gave tools to players to allow them to create the content themselves in some ways. And then you have games like Caves of Cod, who have been entirely constructed in a way that is very favorable to this kind of adding random scripts and random stuff at load time and trying to make sense of it in ways that are smart and cohesive. Every person who writes a mod for Caves of Cod benefits from the rich AI techniques and project techniques inside Caves of Cod, and the developers made them in a way that is intelligent enough to give tools to these mods to use all the power of the clever systems they have designed. And developers went further. They even created collaboration spaces between modders, but also between modders and themselves. And in those spaces, like their Discord servers or the Steam workshops, for instance, they share documentations between each other, tips and tricks, between developers and modders. They intervene directly. So those are examples of games who expand the generative space, not only thanks to cool tech, but also because they have designed this tech and the social spaces around the creative community, and they want to actively support it. The common points between Wilderness and what we have seen within modding communities, which are very interesting, is that in both these cases, AI techniques are designed for supporting a creative community that wants to design games, to take part into the design, and to explore games in a new and interesting way. Now, within our final part, we'll share with you our 2 visions of how we can apply these ideas using AI, using in new ways to possibly create spaces of playful experiences that both haven't been seen before and also do not harm and actually support people.
Okay, so onto the first vision, which is generative archaeology. So to give you a bit of background, I'm currently studying for a PhD in games AI, but I wasn't always doing that, of course. I was a field archaeologist before and also a heritage consultant. And I've done over the past few years quite a bit of independent research in the area of archaeogaming, which is the archaeological study of video games. And so out of that, I've now coined this term generative archaeology, and that builds on the concept of generative forensic games put forward by Mike Cook, which is the idea that you have games with procedurally generated content in them, and the player has to interpret that to understand past events. A good example of a potential generative archaeology game would be Ultima Ratio Regum by Mark Johnson. He's written an article in which he talks about this kind of qualitative procedural generation approach, in which he wanted to generate not just things like space and buildings, but actually abstract concepts like religion. And in the game, the game generates a material culture that relates to these kind of abstract concepts, and then the player can kind of interpret how that relates to kind of the religious beliefs of certain groups in the game. And an example of a generative history game would be The Wind and Rain by Walk by Water. And this game generates historical records, which you then have to choose whether you want to archive or not. So I'm generally really interested in this idea of archaeologically interpreting the ephemera of procedurally generated content. What does it mean to archaeologically interpret something? Well, I would argue that environmental storytelling is a form of archaeological interpretation because it's about telling a story through the environment. So in a generative archaeology game, you would have procedurally generated content, which is then archaeologically interpreted by the player. So trying to make sense of maybe procedurally generated aspects of the environment, artifacts, all kinds of things, and then trying to work out what that might mean about the history of the game world. But then I would also want to encourage the player to archaeologically record their playthrough. But how would that work? So in analog archaeology or real world archaeology, you use various different methods to do that, whether that's photography, kind of site diaries, or making plans. And actually, a lot of these methods kind of translate over to games as well, right? Because lots of people do things like streaming, map making, fan art, fan wikis, gameplay diaries. These are all methods of players trying to record their own gameplay. So I would incorporate this as a core part of the gameplay experience of generative archaeology games. And I've got a few examples of like different ways in which I try to experiment with recording my own gameplay experiences. So up in the top left, I've got an example of a study I did of the game Near Automata, in which I tried to record the locations of player deaths on the map. So you can see I've kind of got a map there with different associated screenshots. And then in the top right-hand corner, I've got part of a diary entry that I made for an auto-ethnographic study of playing Pokemon Go while walking around at night in London. And in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a GIF of the game Quiz and Love at the End of the World by Anna Anthropy. This is a interactive fiction game that I really love. And something that's particularly special about it is that it's only 10 seconds long. So that means you can fit it within a single GIF, right? So I was trying to explore with like, how can you record a gameplay loop in just a GIF? And what does that mean? What is that like? And then down in the bottom right-hand corner, I've got a bog standard screenshot of a little game called Elden Ring that you might have heard of. And actually, as a side note, me and Mike, my supervisor, we're actually currently doing a study where we're trying to archaeologically record player messages and bloodstains in the game. So look out for some work on that as well. And funnily enough, I've been really influenced by analog tabletop role-playing games in thinking about generative archaeology games. So Gillian Smith has written an article about the analog history of procedural content generation, in which she talks about how games like Dungeons and Dragons use these analog procedural methods like dice rolls to create a dungeon, right? And she also says that it's simple to create a vast variety of content this way, but it's much harder to create meaningful content. And so how do we do this? Another kind of analog, some analog games that really inspired me are keepsake games. This is a term that's put forward by Xingyin Ko and Jion Shim. And they make games in which the active gameplay actually creates an artifact for the player to keep afterwards. And so this is what I really want to do with having the player archaeologically record their own gameplay experience. Who gets to generate archaeology? Kind of harkening back to what I said earlier in the crypto games section about video games and the aura. Some video game preservationists have argued that a video game's aura extends way beyond the actual gameplay experience. It includes things like online forums, magazines, and of course, that kind of incorporates all these different ways that players record their gameplay, right? Like I mentioned before, screenshots, streaming, whatever that might be. This is an integral part of what is a video game's aura, what makes it special. And also want to reference again Alina Chia's article about PCG, in which she talks about effective tuning, which is like the customization of a generator, resisting documentation, and is often reserved for artists with techno-masculine forms of cultural capital. There are ideas about who can and should do this kind of work. And I really want to try and change that, basically to make it more accessible and to make procedural generation feel like a creative collaborator. And an example of how I've sort of done this myself is I've got a very cursed bit of fan art there on the screen, which is a 7-legged stool, which is something that I discovered in Mike Cook's generative archaeology game, Nothing Beside Remains. So yeah, you too can record such wonderful things. So my final point would be that generative archaeology games encourage the player to creatively collaborate with the game through archaeological interpretation.
Excellent. Now onto our second vision that we'd like to share with you. And this idea, this concept is named live automated game design. A bit before jumping in, let me set up a useful metaphor there. I want you for a second to focus and think that possibly video games are a bit like buying CDs or tapes of your favorite music band, right? In the sense of you're not there while the work is being produced, you're there after. You're not at a concert, you are buying the CD or the cartridge in a store, and it's after when you go back to your home that you experience the whole result of a creative act of making either the game or the music. So video games are a bit like musical recordings in this analogy. And there's an area of games which is fundamentally different from that lens, and that is the realm of roleplay games. In our metaphor, roleplay games will be more like a live performance, more like being in the room with the musicians and somehow collaborating with them or interacting with them while they're making the music. The two core traits of roleplay games, by the way, roleplay games mean tabletop RPG games or alternate reality games or live action RPGs or murder parties or anything that puts you, the player, and lets you play a role and interact and have the game react to what you do, but in a way that is live, adapt its narrative and gameplay, while at the same time involve you in the act of creation and design. For instance, for tabletop RPGs, DMs have to adapt narrative and gameplay all the time. You can't just write the story and tell players to follow it, because they will always go into another direction, and you can't anticipate every situation that will exist. Sometimes you will have to make concessions and decide which kind of rules apply, or if a new situation that didn't exist before, how we are going to handle it in a way that makes everyone feel like it's fair, or unfair, but in a way that they are happy with. And at the same time, the whole burden of creation is not purely on the DMs. All players are somehow involved in the act of creation, of creating a fabric of a story that is being written, or the design of the game that is actually there. Sometimes it can be in very simple ways, like coming up with a backstory of a character, your character often, or deciding which kind of stats or items or abilities that your character has. All of this is a form of design, but is not only on the creators or the game masters in this case, but also shared with the players. We have some video games that also go into that direction, some recent video games. My two examples here are Blazeball and Neurocracy. I'm going to give a quick explanation of both. In the case of Blazeball, I don't know if Kat Manning is there in the chat, but for the purpose of this talk, I will try to give a small explanation of what Blazeball is. I would describe it as a kind of simulation game where fictional players and fictional teams play biblically accurate baseball, and you play the role of the audience who are there to cheer them up and to make bets on their wins and losses and witness the crazy things that can happen within the game. One of the interesting things about Blazeball is that it was, even if you're playing the audience, it's highly interactive in nature. The actions that players do have huge consequences on the direction that the emerging story of Blazeball is going, and that is not only the action that are expected by the game masters. These can also be actions that are a bit out of the ordinary, like players who would find a bug in the simulation and find a way to accumulate a resource that is named peanuts. When Blazeball developers saw that, witnessed that, they made it canon somehow. And in the narrative, in the story of the game, later you would have a peanut god coming back from the sky and saying that you have angered them and that you will have to face the consequences. And that's the case for everything in Blazeball. All the bits of background stories, all the fan art, all the bugs in the simulation, all of the cheat by players are weaved into its narrative and are just part of a fluctuating canon of Blazeball. In the words of Sam Rosenthal, one of the Blazeball developers, one of the beautiful things about Blazeball is that even if the game is not running online, it continues because so much of the game is what the community is putting into it. Now, in the case of Neurocracy, this is a vastly different game. Neurocracy is a kind of mystery game where your main goal is to understand and find who killed a specific person in the near future, in the year 2049. But your only tools to understand what this new world is, or how do people interact with each other, what are their interests, and what are their resources, is to explore it through a fictional Wikipedia. That doesn't sound super interactive at first. But what would happen within Neurocracy is that I would release each week an episode, new articles of Neurocracy, and between releases, players would make theories about what is happening in this fictional world, what kinds of gears and cogs are turning, what are the kinds of manipulations and schemes that some hidden parties are doing, or what are the capabilities of new technology in this world that is often not explained and just left for interpretation and guesses. Well, Younès Rabii, one of the main developers of Neurocracy, would read these theories between episodes and would sometimes feed them back into the story itself, according to their own words. For instance, we have cases where you have a bunch of purposefully blanks left in explanations, and Younès would sometimes read theories and say, that's a good explanation of what actually happened. You know what? Let's make it canon. This becomes the actual theory, the actual truth next episode. So in some ways that were not obvious to players, they had a huge influence on the direction of Neurocracy from episodes to episodes. This is an example of what I would call a live performance for 3 reasons. We have game masters that are not the only source of creation in these games, but instead they let players fill the blank, and then when they look at the output of the players, they make it back part of the whole game, of the whole narrative, of the whole design. So you have this kind of loop where you have the game masters and the players on different sides, and both of them have a flow of creation to one, going from one to another, meaning that both parties are surprised with the direction that the game is going to. Nobody knows exactly where the game is going, but everybody enjoys the ride and the spite of experience. So, before that, this was a talk at GDC. So we would do a shout out to a GDC talk that would happen a bit later. Now it will be probably recorded. So if you can watch Blazeball, game development has performance. We did not coordinate. This is just a good coincidence. You can go watch this talk. I'm sure it will be interesting if you want to look more into Blazeball. There's another common point between Blazeball and Narcossy. Is that for both games, the developing parties were exhausted by doing this kind of work. Sam Rosenthal said that working on Blazeball in this way imposed a crunch-like workload on themselves, and they would joke about working all the hours of each day. In the case of Neurocracy, Younès Rabii did not really plan around this lives update between episodes, and this led to them working after hours, and because this was not part of visual design, this took a toll on their health. This is where I see an opportunity to create tools that would support this kind of experiences, that would support games as live performance, and give tools to creators and players to take part into the experience in a way that is less energy consuming, but is also prone to maybe having a third party that would create things in an interesting way. Let's delve into this idea. I'd like to make it more concrete and share with you a prototype or a concept for the kind of games that this will be in, how this will be experienced by players. So the name of this concept, of the first concept for live automated game design, is a theoretical game that doesn't exist yet, and that is named Miracle Chess. So for the purpose of adapting a game into live automated game design, I decided to take a chess tournament because chess is a game known by all, and you will clearly see the differences between regular chess and Miracle Chess, for instance. So it starts with the idea that it's a chess tournament. Players compete in brackets and play more and more rounds until finals. The main difference with regular chess is that you would start with only a small party of 5 pawns and 1 king, and there's a star on the board. Pawns can walk on the map, and when they walk on a star, they can promote. You might know that when pawns go to the other side of the board, they can be promoted, meaning that they can ask to become another chess piece. Often players would ask to transform a pawn into a queen, because a queen is one of the most powerful chess pieces, because it can move into every orthogonal directions for any number of free cells. The thing is, with Miracle Chess, you don't have to enter the name of a chess piece that exists. You can also enter the name of a chess piece that doesn't exist yet, like an angel, for instance. And what would happen is that the game would do its best to design a chess piece that would somehow feel like an angel. Here's a plausible mechanic. In this suggestion that comes from the game Chesscraft, angels can move one cell in all 8 directions, but all the pieces next to angels can't be captured because it has a kind of protective aura around it. That's just one example of a situation. This would lead Miracle Chess to start as kind of vanilla chess rounds, and the more that time progresses between the tournament, you would see appear more and more fantastic and exotic concepts that doesn't exist in chess yet. Things like unicorns, phoenixes, and angels would appear in-game and would fight between each other, and nobody would exactly know what kind of pieces will exist yet and how they would play from the get-go, at least. Let's push yourselves into the shoes of the players of Miracle Chess to kind of see the kind of experiences that this game would support. Let's imagine that you play the white players and you see a pawn getting to a star and an opposite pawn, and suddenly you see it transform into a demon. And imagine the fear that you would feel when seeing that, knowing that you don't know how a demon plays because it didn't exist before. And the only thing that you know is that a demon in real life is pretty scary. So maybe the devil in this game is also pretty scary. Or on the flip side, imagine losing the upper hand, having only 1 pawn left, but barely made it to the star and you had to do a lot of sacrifices to get to it. Imagine the kind of hope that you would have when asking the game to give you, for instance, a necromancer, and possibly see a mechanic be invented that would let you revive your old teammates and fight with them again. This will be the kind of experiences that will be existing or possible within Miracle Chess. This kind of suspense of not knowing exactly where it would go, this kind of tension where there's always hope that you could win, or always fear that depending on what the other party is going to summon, that things are going to take a very, very different turn. It's a game that will keep you always on your toes, even if chess has been studied by masters for 100 years and even 1,000 years. This would be a way to make chess an exciting and surprising experience again. In the essence, the technology behind it would supposedly be very simple. The generative system there only has to do one job, which is to translate a word in English to a mechanic in chess. We have examples for knight and queen, and the system would probably learn from this example to try to do its best to create other mechanics for the concepts but it hasn't seen, like Angel. This is not 100% just pure fantasy. We have been doing a bit of work into this domain, into this area. If you're interested into ideas into how to translate words into mechanics, or how to make them speak in the same format to be able to manipulate the two, we had a paper published last year that you could look into. It's very readable and easy to read, even for people who have not a lot of knowledge into the concepts used in the paper. So this will be the kind of fine diagram that you would see players and but you would see how players would interact with the generative system. So players would give moves and prompts to the generative system, and the system will execute these moves and sometimes create content reacting to these creative prompts under various circumstances. A simple loop that is constantly creating and listening to what players do. There's one final bit about this concept that is interesting and that is linked to what we showed you about the AI engine in some ways, is that somehow the data has to come from somewhere. If you want to make this happen, you need your generative system to have at least an idea of some form of what an angel is. And the thing is, representations can be harmful, and especially if you need a lot of text and you use the internet for that, they will be harmful. So how do we have a hand? How do we control a bit more these aspects? How to make sure that the community will be less harmed by these kinds of representations? Well, in a classic system, you would use web scraping to have a lot of data, and we have seen that it is a pretty bad idea. Another way to do that will be to notice that you have an audience that is willing to participate in the game, and maybe invite them to crowdsource the data of the generative system. So you would ask every player to give you book recommendations to train the system on, but also maybe possibly include them in the act of creation by asking them to share their work if they want, to bring their fan fiction, their fan art, their own poems, their own work, and to put all of that into a single pot, mix it up, has a big giant soup, and see what would happen at the end when we merge everyone's kind of imagination and design together, and we have a chance to explore it again right after. And this would possibly lead to systems that would have vastly different knowledge representations, sometimes more closer to what communities had in mind, sometimes merging them in ways that find links between concepts in ways that are surprising, new, and possibly exciting. This would be a final diagram. So we have this exterior loop between players and generative system, how we have seen before, creative prompts, moves. And on the middle, you would have this thing where, if you look closely, it's the players who design almost everything. They design the knowledge representation, they design the creative prompts, and the generative system is only a support tool to make that happen and surprise them with their own creations. It's kind of loop where the players and the developers don't merge exactly into one group, but are way closer ever, and both can have playful experiences with the same game. This is an example where live automatic game design can be used to let players take part in the design of playful experiences that are experienced right now, live in live way. But the trick behind it is that you surprise players and your audience with a reaction to their own creation. You listen to them and you try to surprise them with things that they already invented in some ways. So this was sharing our two visions of how we could make AI do interesting and not harmful ways in game design. Let's go over the takeaways really quickly before wrapping up. We want to leave you with two main ideas for you to keep in mind. These two core concepts that could guide you into designing games in a way, into designing AI in games in ways that are not harmful, interesting, surprising. Those two ideas are dubbed. The first one will be, we live in a society. Don't forget that. AI in games has often been used as kind of tech hype, has tech hype where you would tell players that you could generate thousands of worlds, or that you can calculate that many moves in advance or do that many complex things. But often this will focus on the technical complexity of AI there. And often at the price of neglecting design, actually taking time and resources to design the social structure behind the interaction between AI and players in some ways. Even though players and developers and creators are the backbone of games, AI, the way we design AI often forgets them and often harms them. The second core idea is a thing that is often said in the realm of AI, is that it's time to break this idea of a free lunch myth. There is no free lunch. PCG isn't there to save costs or to make things quicker and cheaper at the same time. No, it isn't there to do the same work faster or using less resources. It only does it in a different ways to create different things. It's not a free lunch, it's a different type of meal. So that's it for us. We were Knives and Brushes. So Florence Smith Nicholls and myself, Younès Rabii, we are members of the Knife and Brushes collective, a collective that is interested into creating better places, interesting and novel experiences in play, and using AI tools possibly to do that. If you're interested into seeing more of it, you can follow, of course, the work of Michael Cook and the work into automated game design, or for instance, the works of Mats Johansson and his upcoming PhD thesis that is soon going to be published on generating juice. That is a concept that is already loose. So how do you make a machine understand this concept and create in this domain? That is super interesting. And finally, to leave you on some good words, all these ideas about AI doing harmful ways and the ways that we often are complicit into it, and the ways it harms people to extract value from it. We want to give you a simple maxim to keep in mind, to be mindful of that next time you see tech hype people or crypto bros trying to rope you in, not thinking about the social design for games. This maxim is simple. It's fuck AI research. That's it for us.
Yay. Mic drop.
Excellent.
All right.
Okay.
So
okay, so we'll take some questions in the chat. We're going to look at it right now. Okay, let's see what you have to
Wow,
start.
yeah, lots of great questions. Okay, where should we start? Let's see, I'm going through just to make sure I don't miss anything.
There's this question by, I believe, someone named Malta Reba. Will you be releasing a list of references, articles, etc.? We can share the slides. There's a lot of references on it. So we could possibly share the slides with you so you could look at the references and stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Somewhat also a quick question that I can like quickly answer. Treefolio said, having more talks in the future. Just curious. Yeah, I mean, hopefully. I think like we started up this Twitch channel because, you know, as a group, we have so many different ideas about stuff we want to do. So I think like definitely we'll do more things in the future. Yeah, definitely. Um, I think I see a question about generative archaeology. This is a technique for reading, making sense of your and your community's play experience. It can be performed on proc genless games like you're doing of Elden Ring. Yeah, that's a really good point. What specific synergies do you see between this interpretive method and highly generative games themselves? Yeah, that's a really great question, and I definitely agree. Right, that you can definitely use these kind of recording methods and approaches in like kind of any game. I think the interesting thing I really want to tease out with this project, and certainly I'm right at the beginning of my PhD, so there's so much more to explore with this, but something that I want to look at is kind of how players react to procedurally generated content as opposed to handcrafted content. You know, that idea of perceptual uniqueness of procedurally generated content and how people react to that. And especially because procedurally generated content could be like especially ephemeral, like if it only appears in one particular playthrough, like how do people react to that? So I think that's where I'm going with that, but that's a really great question.
Fascinating. Um, Before answering the next question, I would invite people who posted questions before to post them again, because we kind of just opened the chat and there's a lot of history that isn't there. So we have a question: is the technological barrier of running a dungeon also considered to be a failure? I think when it first launched, it was costing them $10,000 a day to run it. Or we just assume that the hardware will eventually catch up and that's okay. Yes, it is a massive failure too. You have often, there's a trend in AI and with its interaction with games, but also not just with games, with all creative domains. But it's somehow okay to just scale our models in bigger ways and to make them use more and more resources. This is a very bad trend for a lot of reasons. One, this is costly, and not only for people who run the thing. You might be aware of the way that the world is heading into some sort of catastrophe scenarios, and the way we manage our resources is very much linked to that. So this is like a very bad trend to go on. And I believe the numbers for GPT-3, so the models used by AI Dungeon, have very scary numbers. Stuff like for training it, there was a comparison with the amount of F-ship traffic. And if you look at the magnitude of this number, it seems unreasonable. Using that much energy and that much power for a simple adventure game might be a trade-off that we wouldn't do, and that players wouldn't do if they knew about it and if they knew more of the consequences behind it. There's also the aspect of power consolidation. Big labs like Google, OpenAI, or Facebook have an interest in selling you this kind of stuff because they are almost the only one who have the resources, both in data, computer calculation power, and other resources to run that. So they would sell you the access to these techniques as a service and make you the provider and make you dependent on them. That's just a classic capitalism design trick. The thing is, we'd like to, this is not useful for game designers in the sense of, especially indie ones. This doesn't empower people, this make them a bit more dependent on structures that do not have their best interests at heart. We'd like to design and to think of ways to bring generative power back to the people in some ways, to let people have their own tiny models that are imperfect or and homemade, because these models often have a specific taste and a specific specific taste that is very suited to their own community. There's also like some bad design practice, like if you make everything run by a central model, at the end, you lose a lot of individuality and specificity. And the fact that AI Dungeon was trained on text that lacked a lot of minority groups and oppressed groups like Black American people, Hispanic people, educated people, it's not a side effect. This is by design. This is what it means when you say that you just want to gather all the data and centralize in one place. You basically recreate the status quo, and the status quo is hurting people. That's That's just a direct consequence.
Yeah.
Thank you for this question.
I think I saw a question that was about sort of the concept of like copyright around generative art. Sorry if I missed like the full question, but it's an interesting like idea, like who holds the copyright with these kind of like generative systems, right? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Younès.
About copyright and AI generative tools, right?
Yeah.
I think I believe I'm not super equipped to answer this question, but there's a train of thoughts. There's a trend into these discussions that I found very interesting. It's this idea that maybe it's this idea of the author, right? That's an old concept, but it takes a new spin when you think about it with generative AI, in the sense that to make this generative AI, you have to train on a lot of resources, right? On a lot of data, a lot of other works done by other people. In some ways, people say that it's not the model who did this; it's this whole community behind it that cared to it and made it able to create interesting stuff. So they should be credited as authors. And I think that's a very interesting idea, and this is a thing that I would personally find interesting. Not maybe full authors, but acknowledge their presence in their work. But when we think about classical art, for instance, we say things like, no, there's only one or limited amount of artists that made this piece. The thing is, when you look a bit more into it, that isn't true. This isn't how art works. This isn't how creativity works. You are inspired by a creative community. Like, for instance, just look at the jazz scene and how it was born. It will be a bunch of musicians who play together and who learn from the crafts with each other and basically create this new domain, this new field, not thanks to individual people, but thanks to creative community. So you wouldn't credit one person for inventing jazz. That doesn't mean anything, but you would credit a specific creative community, right? I believe we could do that with AI generative things too. How it relates to copyright and law enforcing, I believe this ties with other crossover domains that I'm not expert in. But yeah, I would possibly argue that we could explore a bit more of this idea that somehow we both all participated into creating that, but also not neglect who had the responsibility of actually taking this work and making it happen. It's tricky, but we can do it. We just actually need to think about it, right?
Yeah, it made me think of I know there was that tool called, I think it's Wombo. So it's like you get these certain like platforms or apps which kind of make the process of creating AI generated art easier for people. So in some ways that's kind of like makes it more accessible, but at the other hand, like it becomes almost like another walled garden, right? And I think with Wombo specifically, I remember there were discussions around like Wombo had the rights to whatever images you generated, and then they could like there was some kind of discourse around whether they would use that to make NFTs out of them. And so maybe some people were using that tool and not knowing that then the things they were generating would become NFTs. So there's that kind of aspect as well. And we have a colleague of ours, another PhD student called Amy Smith, is doing kind of work in this area, kind of AI generated art, which is super interesting.
Absolutely. We have a person named Everest that said, I will say that during weights, learning, and all inputs as it's being trained, model outputs is simply creativity laundering for machine power, no matter how you feel about copyright. This, I would empathize a lot with this take, this opinion. I believe that the way we do AI is purposefully designed, or maybe not purposefully, but it's designed in a way that hides things behind the curtain and purposefully leave people with less autonomy and less ability to judge and to possibly refute what is happening and critique the whole process. And this is one of the scariest things. If you play in Neurocracy, these are topics that are handled in game, and these are pretty interesting because it's pretty accurate. Like it's not just hard science fiction. It's things that are being discussed right now, but just projected a few years in the future. And this can give you an idea of the kind of world we are heading into. And if you are happy with the kind of status quo, if you want. There was a question that I copied, which I'm going to paste again. So you imagine the live game design tool to be more compelling in-game experiences of players, or has a work supplement for digital designers? That is, which use do you imagine this work fits into? I believe, no, it's not. One of the core traits of our talk is to say that we don't want to replace any kind of workers. We want to support them. We want to give them tools to create some kind of experiences that they want to. And when I presented to you the games Blaze Bureaucracy, which I would put into the kind of experiences that are close to live performance, I also highlighted some of the limitations and some of the weights it had on developers. And those are, when you have this kind of weights, often we create tools to support it. For instance, in the analog world, D&D players have a whole bunch of resources to help them design things. There's a whole community around creating tools and systems, basically mods for the games. The whole OSR, old school Renaissance movement, for instance, is very interesting. So there's this thing where people create tools for others to reuse and to help them create live experiences. And sometimes you would use a system or use an extension made by someone else and discover it with players live and see what kind of things can happen within the game. But just a supplementary experience, like your experience, your game running table is enriched thanks to the work done by others, and you acknowledge it and you work with them somehow in tandem, even if you don't know them. You collaborate with them to create playful experiences. This is the kind of things we would like to go into, to bring more of that aspect in video games, which is a domain that is kind of bound to a computer, which is a very dumb machine if you think about it, which doesn't have all the prowess of and all the social awareness and responsivity of playing with 5 of your friends on a Saturday evening with a lot of chips and soda. This will be an idea of creating these experiences and going more into that direction with video games, not replacing anything or not making it more compelling, just creating something new that we foresee could exist and would possibly please to a lot of people. Creating a new game genre, basically.
I have another question from Tyler the designer. Regarding the user-generated concept as a way to source the data set, how would you recommend navigating the issue of unpaid labor? What ways can you ensure that you're using the content labor of the players ethically? It's a great question.
It's a great question. And the answer is, think about it. Research this question. It's a very interesting and complex question. And I don't have any easy answer except think about it and design around it. We only showed you visions of possible futures, and there are a lot of roadblocks along the way to think about. Thing is, again, I think we take inspiration from the role-playing communities who engage in the game in ways they know the amount of work they put in it. They know the amount of energy beforehand, they are aware of it, and they make this choice themselves. And sometimes you would have people who would say, okay, if I'm running this game, I need a lot of time. I would need, it's time that I spend not working on other stuff. Would you be okay with maybe donating a bit to kind of fund for the table to make it happen? And people would decide if this happens. They could possibly do that the same way with labor, creative labor. Thing is, these things can happen only if you have full transparency over how your content is going to be used, to which extent, and what are your prospects and directions for the future for your game, and how it relates to commercial things and stuff like that. So this will be a discussion, like any role-playing experience of any kind, by the way. You would sit down with people and ask them what they are willing to do, not willing to do, willing to explore and experience, and design along the way. There is no ultimate things to replicate. There's only discussions to be had and possibly designed custom things based on each discussions, like we do.
I think Mike asked me a question earlier in the chat, which was around like are there copyright issues about archaeologically recording games, which is a really interesting question. because I guess in general, there are just potential issues around recording games, right? That you could come, could be obstacles for you. Something that I kind of encountered, for example, with Elden Ring, which was interesting, is they have like a online gaming code of conduct, and in that it says that, oh, you shouldn't use any of these tools for that which they weren't originally designed. And it was funny because I thought, well, okay, does archaeologically recording the game, like other players' messages, come under that? So in terms of what Elden Ring thinks I should do in this game, am I going against that? I don't know. But I think like more widely, if you're like, for example, recording other players' content, like in Elden Ring, for example, other players' messages, there are kind of like ethical issues around that of, okay, at least in that case, those messages are totally anonymized, but they're still other people's data, and you have to kind of treat that with respect and think about how you're going to collect that data and things like that. So yeah, that was an interesting tangent. And I don't know if there's any more questions or anything that we've missed.
I don't see any, but people are invited to paste them again if needed. Will someone be designing a game based on this talk's chat log? There's a good chance. There's a very good chance.
I really hope so.
And you will have
amazing.
And you will have no say over it. Absolutely no say over it. It can only happen in the future. Like ominous things. Everything you do is recorded and used in some ways to maybe not design directly a game, but maybe, you know what? Actually, if we go deeper into it, I think, yeah, there's a lot of games that are designed using Twitch data analytics, and Twitch data analytics is used using this game log. So yeah, someone would definitely design a game based on this talk chat log, at least partially. It's already happening. Okay. Well, we hope you enjoyed this talk and that it spurred interesting ideas or conversations that you want to have with us. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. We have I always dreamed of saying this. You have our names in the description. You have our Twitter names, or Twitter handles, or mail addresses. Reach out to us. We'll be super happy and to talk to you and to create interesting stuff in our back garden workshops.
Yeah, thanks so much for tuning in and for the really amazing questions. Yeah, so hopefully see you on here at some point soon.
Absolutely. We appreciate you coming there a lot. Like it's so amazing. Mike, whenever you want, you can click on the red button.